faraway Romania, April 27, 1972, and his body was removed from Bucharest to Conakry. The then president of the Guinea, Secretary, ordered that something should be written and put on his casket. And what he asked to be written and put on his casket was that this is the greatest African who ever lived. Perhaps it's a little bit of an exaggeration. But still, that declaration itself is a pointer to the difficulties that African countries have had since independence. It would be good to recall that in 1958, when Guinea became independent, rejecting General de Gaulle's offer to all Francophone countries that they could remain within the Francophone fold and that France would support them. Secretary was the only person who voted no, which so infuriated General de Gaulle that at a rally in Conakry, he was so angry. He was wearing his military uniform. He was so angry that he even left his cap behind. He then ordered that every facility that the French colonial administration had provided Conakry should be removed. So everything was removed, including the electrical cables. The idea was that Guinea would be crushed and it would come running back to France. What Nkrumah did then is probably what encouraged France to grant independence in 1960 to 17 African countries. In 1960 alone, 17 African countries became independent, beginning with Cameroon on January 1st, 1960. And then, of course, in the middle of the year was the independence of the Congo, which became Zaire and is now the Democratic Republic. And there again, we had an African leader who was ready to stand up to the colonial powers and tell them his peace of mind. Of course, he paid the ultimate price for it. This is the case of Patrice Lumumba. Lumumba felt that on the occasion of independence, these people should hear their leaders say exactly what they thought about Belgian colonialism. And it may be interesting to recall that the history of the Congo began in the late 1800s, or the history of modern Congo began in the late 1800s when it became the private property of King Leopold of Belgium. And the kinds of things that happened then, the Congo had a lot of rubber, which was needed then for the newly burgeoning automobile industry. There were no rubber plantations, rubber grew wild. And the things that they did was to require every adult in the Congo of the 1890s to produce a quota of rubber. And if you didn't produce that quota of rubber, your hands were cut off. And in the midst of all this, what happened next is perhaps the greatest demonstration of the close link between the African continent and the diaspora. Because in the Congo at that time was one Reverend Henry Shepherd, an African-American Presbyterian missionary from Virginia. Single-handedly, he managed to collect evidence that through his own intervention made it possible for the United States government, the President of the United States, to take action in the Congo, which finally resulted in the private property of King Leopold to become the so-called Free Congo. Now, that history needed to be recounted on independence. And when Patrice Lumumba recounted that history, he also paid the ultimate price. To begin with, as the Belgians were leaving the Congo, they removed everything, including the electrical cables on the walls, in the hope that Congo would collapse. And these Negroes in deepest, darkest Africa would come running back to their colonial masters. And there again, it was Kwame Nkrumah who came to the rescue, who pressured the United Nations to intervene, who, as a result of the connection he had with another African American, Ralph Bunche, who was then Undersecretary General, the first Undersecretary General of the United Nations, to oversee the process of independence in the Congo. Well, we all know what happened subsequently, and some of the events from that history are still unclear. The independence of the Congo resulted in the mysterious death of the Secretary General of the United Nations, Dag Hammarskjöld. Subsequently, we know what happened. Mobutu Sese Seko Hukumbwendu was abandoned. The cockerel that leaves no hen untouched came to power. And it may also be important to recall that at the end of World War II, those two bombs that were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the raw materials for that bomb was mined in the Congo. And as Ali Mazrui puts it, Africa was there at the beginning of the new world order. We are holding this conference to draw to the attention of our students the very firm link between the African continent and its diasporas. Earlier this year, we had a guest, Ngugi wa Thiong'o, one of whose most influential essays, recent essays, is entitled Dismembering Practices. By that, he means the origins of our modern world today, or their beginning to the dismembering of the African continent. First, it was the removal of the vital workforce of the continent to work in the Americas. A lot has been said about reparations for those who were taken away. Little and next to nothing is said about the challenges that the removal of the vital force of Africa continues to have on the continent today. There are parts of Africa today that have still not recovered. My own home country, the northern region, the most fertile lands, are still empty because that vital force has been removed. So the dismembering practices brought African Americans, brought enslaved Africans to the Americas, from Canada right down to Tierra del Fuego in Chile. That removal of Africans is what made capitalism as we know it today develop the way it did. First, it began in the Middle Ages with a European need for gold to ensure the systems of payments as feudal Europe was developing into a modern state. Once they got the gold to invest, to ensure the systems of payment, once America had been discovered, so to speak, once tobacco became a profitable crop, once sugar became a profitable crop. These are all very difficult crops that needed intense labor and very, very cheap labor. And the only place that labor could be found was from Africa. And this has nothing to do with what some people say about how naturally endowed Africans are with the ability to work. No, Africans are just as capable of working as anybody else. And you may recall that the United States was the last place in America that Africans were brought in chains, because those early founders did not want to use other people's labor, because the so-called Protestant ethic had taken so much hold of them that working hard itself was an act of salvation. But once tobacco and sugar were discovered, that whole story changed. The United States began with the importation of indentured servants, white indentured servants, who were treated just equally as anybody else. The mind boggles that in the 1600s, there were Africans in these parts who owned large properties of land and even employed white laborers on their plantations. The only reason why Africans were enslaved was, one, modern states had not yet developed on the African continent. Those enslaved Africans had no parliament in Africa to speak on their behalf, unlike their English peers. If you mistreated English indentured servants, they would write back to England. Their members of parliament in House of Commons will ask uncomfortable questions, and your royal charter to work in the United States may be withdrawn. That is the reason why poor whites, why early colonial America abandoned the use of poor English people to do their hard work for them. That is the reason why Africans were brought here. And I'm particularly grateful that David Rodiger is here, because his work on the development of whiteness is what leads us to these new analyses of early America.